but this speaks volumes. Failure in communication resulted in a decision to launch based on incomplete and conflicting data. Differences between engineering data and management judgments, and a management structure that permitted internal flight safety problems to bypass key shuttle managers. So these folks are the brightest people in the world, but yet they didn't understand how to communicate together. They didn't understand it at all. The real reason that happened was that the O-ring was tested in the summer in Florida. Well, 80-degree temperatures are a lot different than a cold January day when the launch actually happened. So that degree difference stopped that O-ring from expanding, and the accident happened. Seven different engineers brought up amongst themselves a concern of testing this in the cold weather and delaying the launch. No one listened. At that point, none of them felt comfortable enough to step up and talk to their leaders about what was going on. They all had this idea, but they all sat on their hands. It was a culture issue. Unfortunately, NASA didn't get it right. In 2003, 17 years after the fact, the Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated over Texas on its way back in the atmosphere. The reason for that one was that a piece of foam fell off the wing during its ascent into space. This was a known issue, but yet nothing was done to repair the shuttle while it's on its mission. In fact, it was discussed by 7 different people at that point in time that they should delay re-entry and try and repair the problem. But they didn't. They didn't because they were told by the one team leader that they were overreacting. They were alarmist, that it was no big deal, just to let it go. The problem was that as the investigation ensued, cultural traits and organizational practices detrimental to safety were allowed to develop. Reliance on past successes substitute for sound engineering practices. They were overconfident in what they have done in the past. And organizational barriers that prevented effective communication of critical safety information. Again, people knew that this could happen, but they didn't feel comfortable to speak up. NASA had a culture based on blame. NASA had a culture that didn't promote people to be wrong. They didn't allow people to make a mistake. In fact, when they interviewed afterwards, the staff talked about being ridiculed, being made fun of, being made to feel incompetent, being bullied for their ideas. Now, these are the smartest people in the world that are being picked on and told that they're not smart enough because they made a mistake. That's a problem. So why is it a problem to have a blame-based culture? Why is it a problem to have a culture that's based on only being right? Well, the problem is that if you're worried about being wrong, you tend to hide things, right? You don't want to speak up. You hide your feelings, you hide your thoughts, right? If you're not uber confident to step into an environment, you're not going to fix any problems that are at hand. In a blame-based culture also, we spend a lot of our time trying to avoid blame. Think about it. If you get blamed for something, do you just take it and agree? Or is your instinct to get defensive and to prove yourself wrong, or prove yourself right? Yeah, I get that way. Somebody blames me for something right away. I'm like, no, let's wait about this. Let's talk about this. Right? We spend more of our energy trying to defend ourselves than to solve the problem at hand. Now, to be fair, as I talk about NASA with this, NASA's not the only one with a culture like that. Healthcare is like that as well. Right? I run a small hospital here in town, and we absolutely had a blame-based culture 15 years ago when I started there. Right? We punished people for making mistakes, and because of that, they didn't tell us when they made them. Because of that, they hid problems in care. Because of that, we did not get better or fix the things we need to fix to move forward. So over the years, we made some changes. So what kind of changes do you make? First off, we want an accountable culture, not a blame-based culture. So what's the difference? When we talk about blame, as we talked about earlier, blame has a negative emotional tie to it. Blame has an aspect of culpability, like you should have known better, right? Shame on you. It's the disappointed, tisk, 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 right? Don't behave that way. But accountability is benign. Accountability actually has no emotional tie to it. It's very objective, not subjective like blame. Well, so accountability is something you can do on your own. We can hold ourselves accountable to our own personal behaviors. I'm sure you've heard that before, right? You know, all the training that you've been through with the E plus R equals O is right in line with this. Your values drive your behaviors. Your behaviors then create experiences for everyone around you. Those experiences collectively become your culture. And so that culture is up to you to drive at that point in time. So how do we become an accountable culture? Or a just culture, as we talked about? So there's a couple things that we need to remember with a just culture we need to believe in. First off, to err is human. We all make mistakes. We may want to be perfect, we may think we're going to be perfect, we may get a perfect score on a test or a paper, but that we're not perfect, it's not achievable. Right? And errors happen. It's a part of life. We make mistakes. Nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I can't wait to suck at work today. Right? We're not like that. But it happens. Sometimes we do. And sometimes those mistakes have big consequences as well. But what matters are the system that you work in, the system changes, and the behavioral choices you make. Right? We want to take the focus away from errors and outcome bias, no matter how bad the error is, and focus it on the design and those behavioral changes. So in our story, the system change that was necessary in NASA was the culture. It's up to leadership to set that tone. They needed a culture that rewarded courage, honesty, and integrity, and people would challenge and step up. Once that tone is set, then addressing the individual behaviors that create ridicule and belittling others can be handled at that point. So the other thing that we need to understand is that to drift is human. And this is a big concept. Right? We all drift from expected behaviors. If we don't have constant reminders in front of us of the behaviors that we should be portraying, we're going to drift away from it. Religion has had this in place for eons. Weekly worship, bi-weekly worship, sometimes daily worship, is designed to keep the expected behaviors in front of you at all times. I can't walk anywhere in this school without seeing an E plus R equals O sign anywhere, right? It's because it's a constant reminder to be in front of me. That way we don't drift from the behaviors that are expected from us. But another reason why we drift from expected behaviors sometimes is that we don't always understand the risk around us. You don't realize the risk at hand. So let's take driving, for example, right? My son is almost 17, just got his license, so I'm very familiar with driving and teenagers and all of you what you're going through right now. But the expected behavior of driving is you get in the car, you put the seatbelt on, hands at 10 and 2, focused on the road, the mirrors, no radio, no conversations, no vibing with your friends, no shouting out music, no putting on makeup in the rearview mirror, no texting and driving, right? How many people in this room that can drive with expected behavior every day? Raise your hand. Yeah, exactly. If you did raise your hand, you'd be lying, right? But we don't always understand the risk around us. So let's talk about speeding, for example. What is the risk of speeding? What's the risk of you speeding? What's the worst that can happen? Right? Right. You bypass the stop sign, you bypass the red light. You know, what about the flashers in your rearview mirror? Right? Who's worried about getting a ticket? About getting a fine? About losing your license because you're speeding? The real risk of speeding is safety. It's danger. Science shows that if you speed, you lose control of the car, you go through a stop sign, you go through a stop light, and you cause harm to others or yourself. But because we don't perceive the risk around us, we have to put false consequences in place. We have to put police out to police based on a speed limit to make sure that we follow the directions that are, and the expected behaviors that are out there. So what does a just culture look like? It's one that has leadership based on values and rewarding certain values. Honesty, integrity, walking the talk, doing what you say you're going to do. Education, learning, growing, getting better. Ownership and courage. The courage to speak up and say, I made a mistake, but I want to tell you about it so somebody else doesn't make that mistake. Right? That's what we need to reward and encourage. And also, at that point, if you're exhibiting these behaviors and a mistake is made, a lapse is made, it's okay, it shouldn't be punished. But we should learn from it and move on. We only punish reckless behaviors, selfish behaviors, dishonest behaviors, those that are unwilling to avoid risk or knowingly and purposely causing harm. So let's go back to the speeding, for example. Say you get your first speeding ticket, and the officer comes up the window and you say, I'm so sorry, I wasn't paying attention. I know I didn't pay attention. I didn't mean it. I didn't really notice. I'll be better the next time. And you're lucky enough that they let you off with a warning, right? It happens. But then a month from now, you get pulled over for speeding again, right? Say, I'm sorry, I should have known better, right? I just wasn't paying attention. At that point in time, after doing it twice in a row, you seem to be a little unwilling to avoid risk. What happens at that point? There's no way you're getting out of that ticket at that point in time. You're going to get punished, and you should, right? The idea is that those reckless behaviors are what we want to punish. So what about speeding? Is 30 and a 25 punishable? Is that reckless? What about 80 and a 25? Or 100 and a 55? Is that reckless? Yeah, it probably is. That's a choice at that point in time. 30 and a 25? Yeah, maybe not. 80 and a 25? Absolutely, that's a choice to go that fast. What about texting and driving? Drinking and driving? Are those behavioral choices to put others at risk, that put others at risk unnecessarily? Absolutely, right? So those are the behaviors we want to punish, but not ones that we just make a human error or a mistake. So at the end of the day, what I really want you to take away from this, we are all accountable for our actions. Be accountable for your own actions and hold yourself accountable to your behaviors and values. Humans make mistakes. It's okay, right? Learn from them and move on. Grow from them. Lead with values in mind. All of you are a leader. You're all involved in classes, in teams, in groups for group work. You're all have a chance to be a leader every day. Lead with the right values in mind. Emulate the values that you want to be promoting. There's a difference between blame and accountability. Understand that. Next time you're in a position to place blame, think about that. And maybe realize that that's not the way to go, but work with someone on how to be accountable. And understand that you create the culture around you. Because at the end of the day, in healthcare or in science, as our story tells us, the right culture can save lives, and you can save lives. Thank you very much for your time. Sorry about that.
Okay, so just like with Liz, we'll see if there's any questions from the audience. So raise your hand if you have a question. I actually wanted to get you started. So we're doing the R Factor stuff here.
Yep.
We've got some feedback from students that sometimes it's almost too intentional. And so, you want it to be seen in your behavior. At what point does a culture become less intentional? What I mean by that is, instead of pulling the kid aside and being like, now what was your response, and doing the E plus R equals O equation with them, at what point does it become so commonplace that you don't need to have such intentional usage of phrases or anything that's a part of the culture?
So I will tell you that I don't think that you should ever get away from that intentionality.
Okay.
Right? And so when we talk about the drift and the theory of drift, and that intentionality is there purposely to make sure that you keep the right behaviors in mind and the right phrases in mind too. When you're, if you play sports, right, and say you play football, do you run a play once and then you learn it, or do you run the play 100 times and then the next practice run it 100 more times, right? You want it to get to be habit. So until it becomes habit, you have to be intentional every time. Focused practice is what makes things work. There's a story that it takes 10,000 shots to 10,000 times in a row to change how you react under pressure. So the idea is in kinesiology and from a muscle memory standpoint, you can practice free throws all day long on a basketball court, right? But if you don't practice intentionally with focus, and in the point when you have the pressure on you and the crowds are going wild and you're at the last point, you're at the last play of the game, you have to make that shot to win, you're going to break down unless you've practiced enough times under that pressure. So you have to be intentional, you have to be focused when you practice it.
Okay. What would you say to the teenagers in school when we're trying to build a culture? So if they get sick of the phrases, like we say no BCD, blame Ben. Right? We say DMGB, doesn't matter, get better. We say these different phrases. So if for a teenager it gets to the point, I think, where they're like, we know no BCD, like blah 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 blah, blah whatever. If they get to that point, I mean, how do you overcome that? How do you still take it serious and kind of build on it if they feel that way?
So the way we manage at the hospital is on that values-based management, right? And so we talk about the values that we expect on a daily basis. It's okay if your personal values don't necessarily match that of the work that you're in, but you have to understand that the school, your boss, your employer, your organization, the law, they're the imposers, right? And so at the end of the day, the organization that you're part of sets a group of core values, and it's up to you to follow them, right? And so when they get tired of it, or you get tired of hearing it, right, then at that point you have to make a decision of whether this is a culture that you're going to support or not. When you're in school here, you don't have much of a choice with that. When you're out of school here, then you have a choice at that point to join another organization that maybe doesn't have the same value structure. But just like when you're at work as well, your organization is going to set the values. For example, we value safety. We value patient privacy amongst safety and privacy above all else. Right? There are people that have worked for us that don't take those values as seriously as we do, and they no longer are part of our organization. And that's okay. They can have their values, but maybe somewhere else. And so when you talk about from a school perspective, I get it, and I understand. I have a daughter who's a sophomore, my son is a junior, right? And we go through this all the time, but yeah, I get it. But until you really buy into it and understand it and really try to get it, saying that means you don't. That's right. Saying, yeah, I get it, means you really don't. Yeah.
All right, any questions from the audience? You guys are all over the questions.
I don't know.
Up in the light booth, yes. I can't even see who that is.
So what made you want to have culture be your topic for your talk? Like, are there any examples, like, in the workplace that made you particularly want to point this out and, give a talk about it?
So, as Mr. Miller said, I've given talks about culture and our cultural change. So, a little bit, that's a great question, a little bit about McGregor Hospital and what we've done there with our culture. When I first got there, I'm a pharmacist by trade. So I came to the hospital 15 years ago as the director of pharmacy, and one of the biggest issues that we wanted to deal with was medication errors. Okay, so when we gave medications in error to the patient, or almost gave it to the patient, we actually had in our evaluations when I got there a statement that said if you had more than 2 errors that you were accountable for, we had accountable for the word, but really it didn't mean that, then you weren't eligible for a pay increase. Right? And we had that for our nurses too. And so when there were medication errors, right, who's going to volunteer that there's an error made and then take their bonus pay away or take their raise away or put themselves on evaluation that you were going to be fired because you had too many errors? Who's going to admit to those? Right? It was a complete conflict of interest. So kind of like when your parents look at you, and I do this to my kids so I can say this, but and they get in your grill and they get real close and they get a little mean face and they're like, you can tell me anything. Talk to me. Tell me what's going on. And what they're actually doing is scaring you to death, so you're afraid to talk at that point in time. Yeah, that was the same culture that we had at the hospital. So we changed that all around. We focused on the honesty part of it. We focused on speaking up. We focused on the education part of it. We rewarded people for speaking up. We gave awards for people that spoke up and caused us to look at processes to change. And we rewarded staff for doing that. And we did this over and over and over until it started to take and people felt comfortable with it. So when you talk about what made me want to talk about culture today, society has a hard time not blaming people and not having blame-based cultures. I think that what you're doing here with the R factor is phenomenal. I'm very interested in the study of that, but I can show you data from our hospital when we changed our culture around from a blame-based culture to an open, honest, and one that values integrity. I can show you data where our errors dropped, our safety increased, and I can prove it with science that it works. So it's very, very important to me for that. So I hope that answers your question.
Very cool. All right, thank you. Give it up one more time for Nick Marsico.